When I first heard about Universal Basic Income, or UBI, a few years ago, I thought that it sounded pretty sweet. The gist is that everyone would basically get free money every month. Not a lot, but enough to maybe cover most your bills, and this would theoretically free you up to pursue your passions. For anyone stuck in the grind, working long hours at a dissatisfying job, this sounds like a dream come true. But now, post-pandemic, well, I still think it sounds like a good idea on paper. It's a terrible one in practice. If there's one lesson to be found from COVID, it's that we absolutely do not want to give more power to government. We don't want to be beholden to the authorities any more than we already are. A UBI system would only increase the number of people who are dependent on government to supply their basic needs. And the government, it must be recognized, is not your friend. Politicians no longer serve the people, assuming they ever did. They serve the interests of the various entities who fund them. Big pharma, big tech, multinational corporations, investment firms like BlackRock and Vanguard, the banks, and the billionaire class. That's who really is in charge and making all the important decisions on political and economic policy. The politicians are just puppets for the most part, propped up to give us the illusion of choice. In reality, so-called democracy is kind of a sham. We really don't have much choice when you think about it. Presidential candidates are pre-selected for us, and we're presented with just 2 or 3 viable options, depending on the country, that we never even vetted in the first place. So it usually boils down to choosing the lesser of 2 evils, and that's not much of a choice at all. Legendary comedian George Carlin illustrated this brilliantly on a talk show back in the day.
You don't need a formal conspiracy when interests converge. These people went to the same universities and fraternities. They're on the same boards of directors. They're in the same country clubs. They have like interests. They don't need to call a meeting. They know what's good for them, and they're getting it. And there used to be 7 oil companies. There are now 3. It will soon be 2. The things that matter in this country have been reduced in choice. There are 2 political parties. There are a handful of insurance companies. There are about 6 or 7 information things. But if you want a bagel, there are 23 flavors because you have the illusion. You have the illusion of choice. Right. You don't get the real important choice. There's no freedom of choice.
That's a great point. Right.
It's not an exaggeration to say that all Western governments are basically corrupt to the core at this point, because they're too heavily influenced by special interest groups to make any meaningful decisions for themselves, or to care a whit about the average middle-class person. The old saying, follow the money, is quite apt here. And so having your monthly UBI installment contingent upon a government that doesn't care about you, doesn't really give a crap about your health, prosperity, or happiness, is, in my eyes, a recipe for total disaster. As cutthroat and impersonal as the free market can be, as much as it sucks being stuck in a job you don't enjoy, we're still better off taking our chances in a more decentralized capitalist system than one in which we're financially beholden to the government. Okay, so let's switch gears a bit here and come at this from a different angle. Because politics aside, whether you believe more government is good or bad, there's still a psychological component to all of this. And it has to do with motivation and human nature. There's an underlying assumption behind universal basic income that I mentioned at the beginning, namely that it would free us up to pursue our passions. This is a huge part of its appeal. But if you stop to think about it for a minute, it's really nothing more than wishful thinking. It's naive and frankly dishonest to claim that the only reason you're not already pursuing your passion is because you don't have enough time or money. These are ultimately excuses. We always manage to fit in the things that are most important to us in life. Some way or somehow. We find the time, we make the necessary sacrifices. As a personal example, one of my lifelong goals is to write a novel, or more accurately, a series of fantasy novels on the scale of something like Lord of the Rings. It's an ambitious task to be sure, but I started this venture way back as a teenager, and it's evolved a ton since then. But now, in my mid-30s, with nearly 500 pages of world building and outlining, it's still nowhere close to being finished. And maybe it never will be. I can recall many times while commuting to work or feeling like I was chained to a desk in some boring office job, just longing for the freedom of being a full-time author. I remember reading an interview with one of my favorite fantasy authors, Steven Erikson, where he described his typical workday as sitting down and writing for 4 hours in a coffee shop. And whether he completed an entire chapter or just one paragraph didn't matter. It was about putting in those 4 hours regardless. So I imagined how awesome that would be, being able to set my own hours like that and work on something I was actually passionate about. This was literally my dream job. And yet, when the opportunities arose, where I was either out of work or in school, or otherwise suddenly had a lot of free time on my hands, I inevitably found myself procrastinating. Rather than using that extra time to write, I ended up just playing more video games or watching more YouTube, or found almost any excuse under the sun to avoid doing what was supposedly so important. Because the reality of creative writing is that it's not easy, at least not for me. Unless I'm feeling particularly inspired, I'd often run into that dreaded wall known as writer's block, which can feel like pulling teeth. It's not fun in the slightest. And so that, along with a fear of failing or not living up to my own lofty expectations, has kept me sort of stuck, only making minimal progress in the past decade or so. My quote-unquote dream job, then, is essentially on life support. But this isn't a pity party. I'm not telling you that to, feel sorry for me or anything. It's more of a cautionary tale. I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that don't wait for peachy circumstances to pursue your passions. Don't use a lack of money or free time as convenient excuses. And definitely don't look to something external like UBI as a solution for your starving artist syndrome. Because really, when you think about it, it's just a euphemistic rebranding of universal welfare, which is not something any of us should be crying out for. A society where every citizen is effectively on welfare is not exactly a healthy one, to put it mildly. Moreover, who's to say that having greater financial security wouldn't have the opposite effect and actually demotivate you? It's natural to become lazy and complacent when we get too comfortable. Many of the most successful people came from the bottom. They rose out of poverty because being poor and struggling to survive motivated them to escape their wretched circumstances. So let's leave the government handouts to those who really need them and not be lured in by false promises of free money. Nothing in life is free. Everything has a cost, and this would undoubtedly come with strings attached as well. Make no mistake, UBI is not some futuristic socialist utopia, but rather a dystopia wearing sheep's clothing.